lunch. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Gerri Aglipa is the Midwest Director of Small Business Majority, which means she directs the outreach, education, and policy efforts in the Midwest and Greater Chicago area. She also manages Small Business Majority's national outreach to women entrepreneurs and women business organizations. She was a former entrepreneur herself, so her passion will be evident in her presentation. She's going to be talking about leveling the field, equity in small business recovery. And with that, Gerri, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon all, and thank you for having me. I hope you're all well rested and you're enjoying the conference. I'm going to share my screen here a second, and I'm going to go over today and talk about leveling the field, equity in small business recovery. What does that mean for all of us in the small business ecosystem as we are slowly recovering from the pandemic? And what does it mean for us to support small business owners, especially in underserved areas? As Don said, I'm the director of the Midwest region, and I'm also the director for National Women's Entrepreneurship for Small Business Majority. It's good to see some of you again. Hope you're having a good conference as well. Just to give a bit of background about Small Business Majority, we are a nonprofit 501c3 education and policy organization, which we advocate and make sure that the self-employed and small business owners are empowered to drive a thriving and equitable economy. We have a particular focus also on small business owners and the self-employed and underserved community, and especially those who are impacted by systemic bias. Across our organization, which we're celebrating our 15-year anniversary, we have a network of more than 85,000 small businesses with 8 offices across the country. Not only do we engage in education efforts with our partners such as the IESBGA and some of you on this call, but we're also engaged in policy and advocacy efforts, conducting research with small business owners, and actually advocating for policies, laws, and regulations that facilitate small business ownership from an equitable lens. Since the pandemic, we've actually conducted more than 400 events connecting 57,000 small business owners with resources. And we're constantly advocating for advocacy to improve PPP loan forgiveness processes, EIDL, and other federal loan stimulus programs. I know some of you participate with our bi-weekly webinar with the SBA that we have that constantly update small business owners on what are the latest news regarding small businesses, especially in regard to disaster pandemic relief aid. If you have small, we often get asked small business owners asking of us, how do we join Small Business Majority? Just simply sign up for our newsletter as a 501c3. We're here to support you as our partners and small business owners with free education and engagement in policy to make sure their voices are heard at the table. Now, some of the ways that we can also offer and foster policy that Small Business Majority does is we have a policy platform where we lift up all entrepreneurs. We advocate for state and federal policies that impact women and owners of color through not only our federal policy platform, but also our state. We have an Illinois state policy agenda as well. We also conduct education trainings with some of you on this conference as well to deliver trainings such as navigating access to capital, avoiding predatory lending, procurement, most recently, how to grow women-owned small businesses beyond $50,000. We make sure that owners know how to navigate capital and also access knowledge capital and social capital. And we have strong partnership with the SBDCs to make sure that owners are also aware where to go to work with people for those advisory service and get those trainings one-on-one, either through cohort trainings or through mentorships through the SBDC network. Small Business Majority is also an ecosystem builder. We convene stakeholders to support the safety net support system for entrepreneurs through financial capital, knowledge capital, and social capital. We've also convened organizations like the SBDC network. For instance, ecosystem building. We've created the toolkit for the Chicago Inclusive Growth Coalition, for standards for business service organizations who are providing support in underserved areas through this toolkit of recommended metrics and measures as well. We have an online resource hub, venturize.org, which was actually developed by our partners at Opportunity Finance Network, who many of you know as the Association for the CDFIs in the United States. Our partners at Opportunity Finance Network helped develop venturize.org, and in partnership with Small Business Majority, we now manage venturize.org, which is a free online resource hub to make sure that small business owners get the information they need from an unbiased lens in order to navigate financing and make informed, safe, and responsible non-predatory financing decisions. We actually, on this website, have developed a COVID-19 pandemic site where people can access what's happening in terms of disaster relief aid. But we also have a tip sheet on how to navigate predatory lending during COVID-19, which is not only in English and Spanish, but 17 Asian American Pacific Islander languages. Now, I'm going to talk about the state of small business, COVID-19 impacts, equity and economic prosperity. What does race, gender, and geography have to do with it? Inclusive recovery and growth in underserved areas and populations, and our leadership together for economic prosperity. We know that business owners of color have challenges accessing capital and in a worse financial shape compared to their white counterparts. In fact, our own research at Small Business Majority has shown, as an indicator, if you were to look at PPP loans, that white self-employed small business owners were more likely to have applied for PPP compared to Black and Latino small business owners. Our partners at the Federal Reserve, their annual small business credit survey has shown that business owners of color, businesses owned by people of color, were more likely to report negative financial conditions than their white counterparts. Before the pandemic began, women and minority small businesses received just 4% and 5% respectively of conventional small business loans. This problem was occurring even before the pandemic, and magnified what the pandemic pulled back is the systemic problems that are seen with owners of color, women, especially women of low wealth and assets, and those who are in underserved, disadvantaged, and disinvested areas. Access to pandemic disaster relief funds and banking systems actually favor the well-banked, well-connected, well-heeled, and more affluent owners. I know we've all dealt in the last 16 months with the challenges of what was happening with owners and clients who came to us regarding PPP and EIDL. That challenge was exacerbated by the fact that the systems before pandemic began was prioritizing white males over owners of color and women. What happens is that this actually enables predatory lending practices that target owners of color and women. Predatory lending, online lending per se, is not regulated in the United States at this point. So it's not regulated by the federal government. It allows a lot of bad actors to play in the space and prey on owners who are pressed against the wall looking for funding. Predatory lending thrives in this market where it's actually legal for bad actors to disguise their fees. Small Business Majority is actually a founding organizational member for the Responsible Business Lending Coalition, advocating for truth in lending law to regulate and assure safe small business financing. In fact, we were the first state, Illinois, to introduce an anti-online predatory lending loan led by partners of ours and led by Small Business Majority. It didn't pass, unfortunately, but we are hoping that there's going to be passage of federal legislation at that national level to regulate online lending. Also know the inequality in relief funding also impacts self-employed business owners. 90% of women are self-employed with no employees but the owner. And women tend to go into businesses that have lower assets because they don't have the assets themselves to start them up. So they go into less capital intensive programs. But did you know that actually 95% of Black-owned businesses, 96% of Latino businesses, and overall 86% of businesses of color are also self-employed? Self-employed with the PPP locked out many of those solo entrepreneurs because of the calculations, as we all know, based on net income instead of gross, which was later remedied but that severely impacted the inability for these owners to access aid. So access to disaster relief fund was not equitable the first few months of the pandemic. It took quite a while for that to be remedied. And there's been disproportionate closures. More Black and Latino businesses closed more temporarily than white business owners, according to Small Business Minority Research. Closures, whether temporary or permanent, severely impact the economic stability of a local neighborhood and job creation as well. And so we know that the closures have a ripple effect in the neighborhoods that the small business owners serve. There are also additional barriers to entrepreneurship. Mounting business debts. Nearly half of all small businesses with under $100,000 in revenue and who have commercial space are 1 or more months behind on rent. That's not counting the thousands of business owners who have business debts to service as well, such as other SBA loans, non-SBA loans, other lines of credit that they also have to service and pay back that they did not get a deferment of. Our own research showed that 1 in 4 business owners will not survive through COVID recovery without additional funds. So we are advocating at our national office, federal office in DC, to address this issue about owners who had indicated to us in the survey nationally that they won't survive throughout recovery without additional relief funding. Small businesses are also impacted by a hiring crisis. There's an inability to find workers. This is impacting their business revenues and job creation. So where everybody is talking about job creation, unfortunately, many of the small businesses and in certain industries are having challenges hiring workers. This is further set back by pandemic health mandates across the country, not so much in Illinois, but with the Delta variant and public health closures or recommendations, this is further going to have a factor in how small businesses are also impacted. I'd like to also add, going back to capital access, the FICO score, the FICO credit score also fuels racial and gender disparities that I talked about a couple of minutes ago in regards to how women and owners of color are able to access credit and capital. That FICO score and a prioritization of the FICO score actually widens the gap on the opportunities to access capital. We also have 2 Americas. What am I talking about with 2 Americas? Well, I'm talking about the fact of the latest news that we actually have a 2 Americas of those who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. These public health situations of vaccinations versus unvaccinations is causing economic strife and fractures within our small businesses and their local neighborhoods. So it isn't just mounting business debts, inability to access capital, and maybe even the FICO scores in a lot of cases as a barrier, but it's a hiring crisis and a woe of a struggle of 2 Americas being affected by the pandemic, of course, but also people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. And that is impacting how fast our country and the state of Illinois can speed up recovery as well. Now, there we go here. What's some of the issues that are impacting also recovery? You've heard a lot in the news about the infrastructure bill. Well, there's 2 types of infrastructure bills actually within that package that we're talking about. One is traditional infrastructure, the roads, the transportations that we're talking about that will have a ripple effect of small businesses' ability to retain contracts, obtain contracts, create jobs. There's also the care economy. How would we pay for paid family medical leave insurance? How do we sustain some of the temporary tax credits, which are temporary, child care tax credits? How would we make them more permanent for parents? Well, Small Business Majority has conducted national research, and there's actually a large majority of owners who favor increasing the tax rate on the wealthy to pay for infrastructure support and economic recovery and growth. That's 67% of small businesses that owners who support this. So think about that when we talk about policies, and what infrastructure really means isn't just related to roads and trains and transportations, but it's also related to the care infrastructure, how we take care of and balance our homes for our children, our adult parents. How do we take care of balancing that work-life balance that we've all been under the stress for the last 17 months. I want to talk about equity and economic prosperity, race, gender, and geography. Next to home ownership, small business ownership is the top way to build wealth, build assets, create generational wealth to close the racial wealth gap, and create financial security. This all helps to strengthen economic prosperity. However, racial and gender wealth gap that we all know about affects the access to capital and the ability to obtain opportunities to access capital as well. Racial and gender bias is actually present across our systemic practices and policies, and it's disproportionately affecting owners in those underserved areas. For instance, what we've seen in the last few decades, and as I noted earlier, with 4% and 5% owners of color and women receiving less capital compared to white males, is that this is the effects of the decades of redlining policies and Jim Crow laws, which actually legalized racial segregation. And this also impacts women too. It wasn't until 1988 with the Women's Business Ownership Act that women were allowed to access capital and not have a man co-sign their business loans as well. That's not very long ago, and we're looking against that with the context of history, how long women would actually legalize to not have a male co-sign their business loan. The Women's Business Opportunity Act also ushered in a whole new era of funding set-asides for women business owners. So just remember that the next time we celebrate the anniversary of the Women's Business Ownership Act. We talk a lot about equity, but what we're hearing a lot is individuals not understanding the difference between equity and equality, and sometimes it gets confused. Equality is giving the same resources and assumes that each person can access those resources and opportunities equally and will benefit equally, regardless of individual and societal barriers. Unfortunately, equality doesn't often consider context or under-considers context, especially when we think about systemic and individual barriers and obstacles that affect people's ability to access these opportunities. When we begin to understand the difference between equity and equality, we begin to improve how small business services are designed and delivered, how we evaluate our services. Are we making an impact? But understanding the differences between equality and equity also helps us to craft better policies more intentionally and also implement them well. Half of policy is not just passing that, but it's actually more important. How do we implement it so that we're assured everybody equally and equitably benefits from those policies? Equity considers what people need individually to overcome barriers and access those resources and opportunities. They're inclusively designed, as I noted earlier with policies, to address both individual and societal obstacles. Place-based strategies and interventions are key to wealth status and opportunities. This is also a factor that we see in how we understand the clients that we serve who come to us. What is their place? Where are they at? Not just what are their assets? What is their business model? What is their idea? Businesses in underserved neighborhoods tend to correlate with communities that also exhibit poor health indicators, communities that lack secure housing and affordable housing and transportation, but communities that have also been plagued historically with racial segregation. So place is a very key factor when we understand about how the intersection of race, gender, and place play against one another as well. What do we know about equity? Well, Bennett and Pastor, the researchers and the Federal Reserve over the last few years, especially since the last recession, have noticed that policies and practice that address racial inclusion in areas actually measurably strengthens inclusive economic growth. I'm going to repeat that. Research by the Federal Reserve and Bennett and Pastor has shown, most especially when they've seen the trajectory since the last recession in 2008, areas that also address racial inclusion measurably strengthen inclusive economic growth, not just economic growth in general. So what do we need for recovery? We actually, I think, need a post-pandemic culture for an entrepreneurship 3.0. Somebody was saying to me the other day, oh, we should have an entrepreneurship 2.0. I said to that person at an SBDC, well, let's think about 3.0, because we try to recreate this wheel, and oftentimes we need to look back historically about what went wrong. If we look at it from the context of equity and the 3.0, we begin to acknowledge and reverse racial and gender bias that are rooted in our systems. And we begin to create actual place-based interventions in rural areas, in micropolitan areas, and in metropolitan areas. Post-pandemic culture for entrepreneurship in a new economy. And this new economy is also going to be a green economy, as we would expect, because of what's happening with the country and the global changes with climate change as well. Inclusive recovery and growth in underserved areas and populations. How do we address racial and gender inclusion? If Bennett and Pastor noted that associated with inclusive economic growth, not just economic growth, but inclusive economic growth, is racial and gender inclusion. How do we do that? We need to address how do we integrate that, because it's key to facilitating the diversity in this state to operate sustainable small businesses. Illinois is a very diverse state. So it's not a question of diversity, but it's a question of actually inclusion. How do we grow and use the asset of diversity in our local areas to grow our local economies and expand prosperity, most especially in underserved areas? Some of the tools and resources that could help while addressing racial and gender inclusion in Illinois was really paying attention on place-based flexible debt and equity capital to level the field for business startups and businesses who are growing. Now, I know DCEO has actually released, or soon will release, the IESBGA guidelines for innovative public-private investments for Illinois to start up. Let's consider, what does place-based interventions look like for access to capital? And how does that equitably address, in the long run, racial and gender inclusion in Illinois? There's also policies that we can create that set aside capital, grants, credit for low-income women, Black entrepreneurs, and underserved owners of color. We can also address language accessible services and materials. How much of an investment are we paying towards language accessible services and materials? And not just the materials, but how they are delivered. Do we feel confident in interacting with business owners that there's a language barriers? For those policies, do we need more investments in our small business development service organizations for training for the service providers so that we can better engage small business owners, not just provide a pamphlet that translates in Spanish or in Polish or in Urdu, how to navigate capital? How are we intentionally building this into our systems and processes? There's also economic justice laws to reverse systemic bias. Now, I have to give props to the Illinois Black Caucus for their leadership this past year for passing the Illinois Community Reinvestment Act. The Illinois Community Reinvestment Act, which Small Business Majority with some of its partners advocated for as well, actually is a way to regulate banks and credit unions and financial institutions for Illinois that complements the federal Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act, and it sounds a little dry, but it's a set of banking legislation that regulates how well banks are lending in underserved areas. And what the state of Illinois has done is pass the Illinois Community Reinvestment Act as a complement to the Federal Reinvestment Act. The Federal Reinvestment Act, that often people don't know, and I like history, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of a history here. That set of laws was created as part of civil rights legislation in the 1970s to reverse systemic bias as part of a collection of civil rights financial regulation laws, we like to call it. It came upon the heels of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that was passed in the 1970s. So the Federal Community Reinvestment Act, when you look at it as part of a civil rights legislation to right the wrongs with financial bias in our banking systems. This is what the 21st century Illinois Community Reinvestment Act is designed to do, to right the wrongs in the financial systems, to ensure that capital is flowing to owners in underserved areas and the low and moderate income areas, and to also complement and strengthen the application of the Federal Community Reinvestment Act. Small Business Majority has actually taken a stand on racial and gender bias because we've recognized that it devastates small businesses and stagnates community economic growth. Since 2017 and the violence and actually even a killing that occurred in Charlottesville with the protests occurred, we've spoken up about what racial and gender bias means to small businesses and the devastation and impact upon small businesses and the economy. With the murder of George Floyd in June and the anniversary, we've also stood in solidarity with those who are calling for change and stand with small businesses and communities that were being impacted. I know that it was a challenging time for many of you who are our partners on this call. And I know that I checked in with you, we checked in with one another. So I'd like to say thank you for that. And I appreciate that we are there for one another and that we, as leaders, checked in to see what was happening so that we could support one another. Small Business Majority also took a stand with the rise against anti-Asian Americans in March 2021 after the Georgia massacre. All of this has shown why racial inclusion is important to build economic prosperity and inclusive growth in the future. Again, according to the research and what we've seen in other cities and areas. What can we do for Illinois? Small business development centers have done a great job. Well, how can we grow our leadership together as partner stakeholders in the small business ecosystem? Small businesses in Illinois have really benefited from the SBDCs. In fact, you've held over 1,150 training events, created and retained 6,435 jobs, and helped to support 76,808 jobs per se. You know, all of this is great and also helps to create jobs for small businesses in Illinois and in those underserved areas that are suffering from a wealth gap and a racial wealth gap as well. What can we do? How can we create leadership for equitable and inclusive prosperity in Illinois as service providers in the small business ecosystem through the SBDC network and as partners with stakeholder partners such as funders, elected officials, private entities as well? Let's center on intentionality for impact in our programs, services, and policies to promote racial and gender equity. Again, Illinois is diverse, but we aren't doing enough to take that asset of diversity and build racial inclusion. How can we do that within our own organizations? How do we address cultural and language barriers, for instance, with the immigrant small business owner population? How can we leverage diversity to build racial inclusion and level the field for equitable recovery? We need to approach services and our business interventions, I like to call them interventions, with an inclusive lens to strengthen impact and support small business owners' capacity to actually access capital, funding capital, knowledge capital, social capital as well. How can we do that together as small businesses and our service providers? As a service provider, whether or not you're a hub or a spoke, when we work with clients in underserved areas to provide training and counseling, let's ask the question, how can we capitalize on the diversity in our communities to drive equity and inclusion in our trainings and how we communicate to our clients? Let's be more creative and intentional about ways to embed inclusion, for instance, in our client feedback. When we're looking for verbal feedback, are we framing the right question to understand, are we meeting owners where they really are at? So for instance, let's say we have a startup or growth business cohort of people who are mostly low, moderate income owners, or who may be operating in underserved areas, or maybe they're predominantly Black or brown. In general, we're accustomed to ask feedback questions on a forum afterwards from a generic lens of, What did you think of the training? Rank it 1 through 5, with 5 being great. What about challenging ourselves to uphold a commitment to inclusion when we seek to improve our programs? For instance, ask with intentionality, one-on-one. Rick, as a Black-owned small business owner in Aurora, Illinois, did that training meet your needs? Does it meet the needs of other Black owners in Aurora or this region? Or if you're dealing with a woman-owned business, you can say, Shelley, hey, as a woman-owned business owner in Effingham, Illinois, did you find that training counseling sessions helpful for you and other women in your area who come to our trainings or our counseling sessions? This is intentionality when fostering equity and inclusion in our services and following up one-on-one for impact. It doesn't have to be elaborately designed inquiry, just simple, informal gathering of verbal feedback as a qualitative measure on how you are meeting owners where they are at and giving them what they need. Let's look at capital. When we as service providers help navigate or counsel and guide owners on the plethora, and there is a lot of different type of capitals, be it loans, lines of credit, equity, or grants, how do we foster inclusion and intentionality in our communication? Take, for example, the EIDL targeted advances, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Advance from the federal government. In the fact sheet, it's written as, the advance seeks to advance equity by carving out funds for owners in low income areas. And when we talk about it, I've noticed that we generally say, you may be on the lookout in your email because this is for owners who are located in a low income community. And here's the link to see if you operate a business in such an area. But if we were to build in intentionality for inclusionary impact, and it was woven in our communication, we might instead say, hey, Bill, this targeted EIDL advance, did you know that was created because Congress recognizes that Black small business owners and other underserved owners may be located in low-income communities. And these owners have historically been locked out of equitable funding because of systemic racism. That's why it's important for you to be aware of this funding. Look out for that in your email because it will help you. Or we frame, hey, Beth, this targeted EIDL advance, you're a woman-owned business in an area that has high poverty levels, and we also know you've been struggling for the last 16 months. We want to help you more and let you know this funding may be available to you because of simply where your business is located. Framing how these funding opportunities, especially for federal disaster relief programs, are actually meant to be carved out for equity actually changes the impact upon how the owners will listen to what we are saying to look out for in their emails. From an owner perspective, what we say and how we frame it resonates and influences how other owners also consequently view and how they connect with capital. Reframing messaging by providing context similar to the context of what the difference is between equity and equality, providing context as to why a funding product is equitable, was designed to be equitable, actually will resonate longer with owners who are in underserved areas. It also helps to increase their interest to seek and apply for equity-driven capital. Reframing personally speaks to the majority of owners, not only throughout Illinois, but all of America. Reframing for inclusion gets to the root of the fact that thousands of owners have been shut out of opportunities this past 17 months, especially pre-pandemic, those who lack knowledge capital, social capital, and financial resources. These are resources that would have helped them to better weather the severe economic setbacks like this pandemic. It's exacerbated by the fact that racial and gender bias fuels the wealth gap, which is also additionally further exacerbated by income volatility. Given what our communities nationwide have experienced the last several years in particular, the pandemic has magnified these disparities have been mounting for decades. So it's important to remember context and speak intentionally about why products like the EIDL targeted advance, carve-outs and tax credits for underserved owners are aimed and created to be inclusive, to level the field and create equity. So as we slowly recover from the pandemic and we work to continue with one another to expand our services together to help small businesses in a new pandemic economy, post-pandemic economy, excuse me, we need to commit to being intentional in our communications on why racial and gender equity should be a goal in recovery, because it's associated with fair and just economic prosperity. One way to do this is continuing to speak the narrative on why funding products and training programs that support underserved business owners, Black, Brown, women of low wealth and assets, those in disinvested areas, how does racial and gender equity advance economic prosperity? The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us how to leverage technology, tools, and software and broadband connections to expand the reach of services. Think about how we could leverage that technology. How do we continue to do that? Through hybridized ways. How do we expand our reach? I've spoken to some of you at these SBDCs. Some of you are going internationally as well. Continue to adopt that continuous process of quality improvement through leveraging technology in the future. How can you use that to overcome geographic barriers and support owners in underserved communities? Let me take the concept of inclusion one step further and address context again. When owners come to our trainings or your counseling and advisement, consider how they are also contextually affected by food insecurity, the loss of their job. Some of the owners that we work with even have 2 or 3 jobs. What happens if they lose one of them as they're starting up their business venture? Or their inability to make alimony or childcare payments, housing insecurity, healthcare issues, childcare responsibilities. We all know the owner who had to step away from their business to help their adult children with daycare this past year, or had to take care of a major issue, or has high student credit card debt. These are economic and care burdens. These care burdens are disproportionately felt by owners in underserved communities. I know we all have intake forms that inquire about the status, background, and even the use of public benefits. To work toward equity, we should make it a more regular practice to not only look at the demographic trend data on the intake forms, but further examine how does this data inform how we're crafting our business advisement services for more inclusive engagement. Can we do a better job actively listening to what clients are saying and responding to them accordingly? For example, we know the data that more than half of entrepreneurs in the United States are age 55 and older. So what does this mean when we approach Black and Brown owners who are 55 years and older and have been impacted by the pandemic, knowing that there's a racial wealth gap in this country where Black households have on average, their wealth is $24,000 compared to on average $188,000 to white households. What does this mean when we're taking that context into consideration? What does it mean when we provide recovery and capital support for a woman-owned small business owner living in Rockford, Illinois, or the west side of Chicago? And you also know that overall women in America retire with 80 times less wealth than men. What does it mean to also prioritize the success of that women-owned business? When we engage with small business owners, especially those in disinvested areas, we need to be more conscious about demographics and context, the stage in life of that business owner, how that actually influenced small business survivability and their ability to weather issues and situations like the pandemic. We know women of low wealth and assets have little resources for childcare. How do we leverage our partnerships in the community to offer affordable and free childcare for women who want to take our trainings? When Small Business Majority offered free childcare on the west side of Chicago with our partners, the SBDC at Westside Forward, the response was overwhelming. I can tell you it was so high. To foster inclusion and equity in what I like to call interventions for small businesses also includes an understanding of the individual and the community which they live and operate their business. The intake forms help. Staff onboarding also helps to provide a snapshot of the clients and community demographics. We want to quickly talk about equitable prosperity in a region. How do we support small business owners who want to hire workers, who want to hire even just 1 or 2 more workers to increase their revenues and also create more jobs? It's about job creation now. Everybody's talking about job creation. I know I said earlier there's a challenge of hiring, but there's also pressure to create jobs as well. How can we, as stakeholders and service providers in the small business ecosystem, challenge ourselves to further strengthen financial capability and help owners generate more revenues, become more profitable, have positive EBITDA, 1 full-time job in the next 5 years, at least 1. Because research shows that if policies, funding support, and programs could improve support for 15% of Black non-employer firms, that's solo firms, self-employed, to hire 1 more person besides the owner, and current employer firms hire 2 more, then 1 in 3 of the current unemployed Black labor force in America would be employed, and we would address helping to close that racial wealth gap. Let's create goals for one another, for ourselves as well. Like 10-10-10. It's just an idea, but focusing 10% of self-employed owners creating 1 additional job, 10% of the owners who have employer firms create 2 additional jobs in the next 10 years. Now, it's just an idea of Gerri's, but it's an idea that you get what I mean. We should be intentionally setting authentic goals on growing jobs through even the smallest of the small businesses as well. What can we do moving forward as small business providers and stakeholders? We need to be leaders, inclusive leaders, innovative leaders, trusted leaders, steadfast leaders. Be that inclusive leader by actively fostering representation of underserved owners' views and redesign that table or rebuild that table for who is represented. As an inclusive leader, you have the ability to speak and act and behave in ways that make owners and clients feel more or less included. How people feel heard and included makes a huge difference in their level of engagement of your business advising, of our trainings that we deliver, and at how they're going to apply their skills and knowledge in their business. Actually, don't just be an inclusive leader, be a fearless leader. Be ready to confront individual and collective discomfort that's expected by some whenever racial and gender diversity, equity, and inclusion are addressed. This is the reality. For post-pandemic recovery at both the federal and state level, everybody, from the presidential administration to the governor's office, everybody is taking a hard look at how existing systems actually foster bias and segregations. But the conversations have not been and are not always going to be comfortable and easy all the time for many individuals and organizations. So don't just be an inclusive leader, be ready to be a fearless inclusive leader. Get buy-in for a shared vision to achieve regional equity. You need that unity of vision from a sizable number of us. And I know there's me, including many of you on this call, we have a shared vision. We need to build that solidarity in how we support small business owners across class, race, and geographic barriers. Small Business Majority is actually creating councils and committees within our states, and one in Illinois devoted to equity and prosperity of small business owners, an Equity and Prosperity Committee. Be innovative leaders, not just fearless and inclusive, but be an innovative leader. You've heard of stay in your lane? Well, you'll need to stray from your lane from time to time. Create partnerships. What is the role of SBDCs in creating connections across the small business ecosystem, such as with the U.S. Minority Business Development Agency or the Chicago Minority Supplier Development Council, especially for those business owners who are poised for growth above $4 million. Owners cannot find workers. How can we better connect owners through our local workforce centers to find employees? How are you being a leader in creating community partnerships to refer owners who are having technology barriers access to technology, who are having housing issues, who don't know how to get help with their Medicaid, who have child and elder care concerns, or even struggle to put food on the table. All of this context impacts the ability of an owner to focus, to start and grow their businesses, especially those who are already working a full-time job or multiple jobs. Let's be more innovative in supporting not only the financial and business development safety net for small business owners, but also strengthen ties to one another and to other organizations that can support the human and social needs of entrepreneurs. Be that innovative leader that fosters partnerships. And there's two types of partnerships, transactional and trusted. Everybody has transactional partnerships. Trusted, that's a little different. You will need to build trusted partnerships. What happens when you learn leaders and staff at an organization would make questionable comments about gays or lesbians or women or Blacks? If that's a potential problem, what will you do? What will you do if you discover a partner financial institution is engaged all of a sudden in predatory practices or may peddle a new loan product that has, some questions? Are you going to have a trusted partnership with that organization? A transactional partnership? No partnership? Be conscious how you create trusted partnerships for the long game. Trust, according to Webster's, is confidence you have in one another to be reliable. Be leaders in demonstrating how to have trusted partnerships for equitable recovery and growth. Be that trusted leader to demand that it's not just us in the service delivery end of the small business ecosystem that shoulders responsibility, but everybody. We have to hold our public and private leaders accountable as to how they're leveraging our state's diversity to advance racial and gender inclusion in their policies and practices if we want to see small businesses in Illinois prosper and grow. Now, I've talked about transactional partnerships, trusted partnerships, and inclusive partnerships as well. I want to talk in this last slide here about being a steadfast partner. Also, I talked about what you can do for intentionality and impact in our services and programs. Also, some of the points that I just made really point that equity is a long game, but it has big wins for all, and being that steadfast leader. But this quote from James Baldwin, "The moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out." Don't just be an inclusive leader, but a steadfast leader that has faith in one another. Demonstrate that leadership of having faith in one another. It's not been an easy 17 months for all of us. With the pandemic, the George Floyd murder and demonstrations, the anti-Asian violence, the Me Too movement and the misogyny that has been called out, it's been challenging. And this all impacts small business ownership and entrepreneurship and has an impact upon the commercial corridors of small businesses where they operate as well. Be that steadfast leader that has faith in one another, that will be that beacon of light about how we also get through the uncertain times, not just the certain times, because it has been the last 17 months, times of uncertainty as well, and hesitation. And as we've seen also with the recent news. So continue to not only be an inclusive leader, but a steadfast leader who demonstrates leadership to have faith in one another as well. Be that leader to show what inclusive growth looks like for small business equitable recovery in Illinois. Thank you for having me. Have a good conference. Be well and be safe.
All right, thank you to those of you who are still here. Gerri is done. And we'll see all of you at 2 o'clock. Enjoy the rest of your break. Take care. Melissa, did you have any final comments?
No, I didn't.